decision to say, one, automatically some people are going to hate you, right? Oh, how could you let your wife die? You didn't love her enough. You chose her and yet you let her die. Or like, oh, how could you let your mother die? You know, you don't respect your elders enough. You know, you just thought about, you know, your wife. You let her die, right? So there's no rational reason to prefer one of the other in this case. What it comes down to is a conflict between different moral considerations, right? This moral framework that you're part of ends up determining which decision that you make. And each is equally rational as each other, right? So Rawls then believes that as a result of these disagreements that are reasonable disagreements, that he has to change his argument. You know, previously his argument is like, no reasonable person can disagree with me. I'm going to construct an argument that every rational person agrees with. Right? That's how contractarianism works. So create an argument that no reasonable person can disagree with, and then convince everybody. Now 20 years later, he discovers, oh crap, reasonable people can disagree with me. Oh, that's a bit of a problem for my theory, right? My theory was entirely based on everybody agreeing. And now, I've decided that I believe reasonable people can disagree with each other. So then I need to limit my argument somewhat. You know, I've got to make a much more conservative argument, not conservative politically, but like a less all-encompassing argument. I've got to convince people of a small amount of things, which I hope that everybody can still agree on, even if they disagree on lots of other things. So Rawls' reasonable conception of the good is what he's trying to convince you of. You know, he's given up on comprehensive liberalism. He says, well, I can't convince everybody of these huge ideas like I tried to before. But I'm still going to try and convince people that we can have a reasonable conception of the good, right? Hopefully enough that everybody can agree on some limited political principles, right? And for him that requires three things. Firstly, the exercise of theoretical reason. Something has to make logical sense in theory. Secondly, the exercise of practical reason. When something makes sense in theory, we should be able to test it in practice, and it should still make sense when we test it in practice. If it doesn't, there's something wrong with our theory, and we need to go back and change our theory, right? And thirdly, and this is kind of an example of why political theory is sometimes bad, right? If you look at, I mean, I'm giving you examples of what not to do. And this is a perfectly good example of a sentence or group of sentences that there is definitely an easier way to say this, but in academic language, we teach ourselves that, okay, the more complicated way to say something is better because it makes us sound more intelligent and it makes knowledge seem like it's more difficult to obtain. Okay? Try and break down the following. While a reasonably comprehensive view is not necessarily fixed and unchanging, it normally belongs to or draws upon a tradition of thought and doctrine. It's not subject to sudden and unexplained changes. It tends to evolve slowly in light of what, from its point of view, it sees as good and sufficient conditions. Now that's an absolutely horrible, horrible group of sentences which tells it's like very obscure, right? And really what he's saying is that, okay, when we arrive at our point of view that we have, the things that we believe, yes, our beliefs do change over time, right? Yes, they normally draw on some sort of tradition of thought from somewhere, right? And mostly, our points of view don't experience rapid change. Okay, you have freaks like Mussolini, for example, who, you know, he was like the editor of a Marxist journal in Italy, and then 5 years later, the leader of the fascist party. Okay, they're weirdos like this, right? But in discussing most people's political beliefs don't rapidly change. Right? You don't suddenly go from being a fascist to a communist, or a communist to a fascist, or a liberal to a conservative, or something like that. Right? People's political beliefs evolve in a much more slow process than this. Right? Based on the fact of this reasonable disagreement stuff that we discussed before. Okay, so what the result of this is that Rawls shifts his position and says, well, if I'm going to convince anybody of anything, I need to make some concessions to this conservative worldview, this communitarian worldview. You know, I've got to recognize that people's beliefs evolve more slowly, and I can't just make a big complicated philosophical argument and hope that everybody suddenly drops the beliefs that they had before and agrees with mine. Right? They're not going to change their mind immediately. So, the result of this is what we call reasonable pluralism. Right? Rawls says that a reasonable person can agree with different ideas about what is good. And yet, reasonable people may be able to respect liberal political institutions. For example, socialists, liberals, and conservatives all like freedom of speech when they have something to say. They like the idea of freedom of speech when they have something that they want to say. They like it less when they don't want their opponent to say something. Right? So here's an example of different political opinions respecting the idea of a liberal political institution like freedom of speech. Okay? But then liking it less when they've already got power. So each political or philosophical tradition can respect liberal institutions for reasons of self-interest. And for Rawls, that leads to what we call an overlapping consensus, where people from different belief systems end up believing in these common small things. They find areas that they can agree. And for Rawls, that's liberal political institutions. He thinks that, the lowest common denominator of politics, I suppose, is that everybody has a space in which they can express their opinion. That's the basis of liberalism. So to summarize these debates, we can see about multiculturalism, the following questions exist. And I have no hard and fast answer to give you about these questions. These are things you have to decide what you actually think about it. Right? So do we value or do we just tolerate cultural diversity? Is cultural diversity good? Does it give benefits? Or does it just exist? Or is it a negative thing? Are you like Mill and the nationalists or things like that? Right? Those are the only positions you can take. Either cultural diversity is beneficial, or it just should be allowed, it's neutral, or it's negative. You can only take these positions. Right? So work out what you think. Do we give rights to individuals, or do we give rights to groups? Right? Kim Lischke said we should give rights to groups because groups can protect cultures, and cultures are a group experience. You can't live it by yourself. Right? Most of liberalism says we give rights to individuals. Which do you believe? Are we independent? Or is culture necessary to discuss whenever we discuss the individual? Do you ever make free choices? Or are your decisions made with reference to the culture that you're part of? Right? What do you believe about this? And if you think culture is important, how are you going to do better than what all of these people have done? Right? All these big professor, theorist people, they've tried to define culture and have mostly failed. Right? We've seen that their definitions are bad. If you gave me their definitions on an exam, I'd probably give you a bad grade because it's not precise, it doesn't tell you anything, it's not a good definition. Right? So if they've tried and failed, how do we take something like culture and define it in a precise way? And does multiculturalism prevent equality, or does it allow for a type of equality that's sensitive to cultural differences? Right? If we treat different people in a different way, does that make equality more or less? That's what you have to work out as well. So before we end this topic, we'll look at a possible criticism of multiculturalism coming from a feminist perspective. Right? And liberal feminism probably offers the most sustained criticism of multiculturalism. On the basis of this, so there's a bunch of cultural traditions that almost every society has participated in some of these at some point in its history. Right? Polygamy is a husband having more than one wife, forced marriage, female circumcision or female genital mutilation, male domestic violence, differential accesses to resources, so men having more opportunities than women, religious segregation, teaching girls and boys differently or teaching them separately, and differential methods of dress. Right? And if we look at all of these things, each of these things is a part of a culture, and each of these things advantages men more than women. So you can kind of see where the feminist criticism is going to come from. So Susan Okin was from New Zealand and basically wrote critiques of different political theories from a feminist perspective. That's pretty much how she made her whole career. He took on people like Rawls and Nozick and communitarians like Walzer and said, well, you know, your entire theory is silent on the question of how it affects women. You know, liberals talk about all this stuff and talk about the family as being part of a private sphere. But then the private sphere affects women in a much different way than it affects men. So the family should not be seen as a neutral institution. You know, it affects different genders very differently. And on the basis of this logic, she developed the essay, Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women? And I've linked it in the course site, and I definitely suggest that you read it. So it's a very simple question. Is multiculturalism bad for women or not? And of course, she's going to argue that it's not good for women, that it is bad for women. So, broadly speaking, Oken argues multiculturalism is bad for women, and in order to understand why she thinks it's bad for women, we need to be very clear about the type of feminism Oken supports and the type of multiculturalism she opposes. So Oken's feminism is a fairly classical liberal definition of feminism, the belief that women should not be disadvantaged by their sex, they should be recognized as having equal human dignity to men, and they should have the opportunity to live equally freely chosen lives as men. There's like liberal feminist definition. Her definition of multiculturalism is it's the claim that's made in the context of basically liberal democracies that minority cultures or ways of life are not protected enough through individual rights, and that as a result, their members should be protected through group rights or special privileges. So Oken's big problem is that when we give group rights to specific cultures, what we're actually giving power to is male decision makers in those cultures, I guess, you know, who dominate those cultures' leadership groups. So culture itself is not monolithic. It's not a singular or undivided thing. Culture impacts men and women in very different ways. And when cultures contain significant division, usually the biggest and most important division is around gender. You know, so cultural frameworks and practices affect men and women very differently. Now, one of the ways that liberal democracies handle this concept of culture is by placing it in the private sphere. And for Oken, this is a big problem because most of the biggest things that exist in the private sphere impact women much more than men, right? Personal decision making, sexual decisions, reproductive decisions, how easy it is to get divorced, or what are the consequences of divorces, morally, socially, that sort of thing. Child custody and child decisions, so who looks after children and who does the effort of raising children, right? All of these things are part of the private sphere. Most governments do not try and regulate these things. And so that's the private sphere, that's the individual decision. You know, we're not going to try and influence this very much, right? And yet, all of these things are greatly impacted by culture. So not every culture has uniform beliefs about these things. Right, so Oken's argument is by giving special cultural rights to certain groups within liberal democracies, this creates a situation where women from minority cultures are being denied the rights that women from the majority culture has. So there ends up being two statuses of women as a result, where the mainstream of womanhood has fought for and struggled for a certain set of political rights, and that these rights aren't extended to women from minority backgrounds. And she has a big problem with this. Okay, so to summarize multiculturalism, we can break it down into certain different areas. There's the question of agency and identity. So to what extent do we have the ability to choose things? Multiculturalists agree with liberals that individuals have the ability to make choices, they have agency. But they don't agree with this liberal view that people make decisions without cultural reference points, right? Here is an argument that says when people make decisions, you make your decision based on the culture that you're part of, or at least that has a significant impact on the decisions that you make. Then we have the debate between culture and rationality. Now historically, liberals have always seen rationality as opposed to culture and tradition, and that their job is to extend rationality into every part of the world. You know? So the debate between liberals and communitarians really shows that culture is something that we're born into. And Therefore, is rationality hostile to culture? Well, multiculturalists try to reconcile the two things and say that, well, if we want institutions that are just, we need both individual and group rights together. You know, we can't have one or the other. There needs to be some sort of balance between rationality and culture. When it comes to freedom, liberals define freedom in very abstract terms as the result of certain just principles, right? The early version of Rawls is an example of that. But most multiculturalists defend liberal freedoms, right? But at the same time, think liberalism can also be intolerant when it's trying to defend freedom itself. You know, so when abstract principles take away a person's right to their identity, this is where multiculturalists have a problem with liberalism. And then we have difference and equality. So feminists and multiculturalists have a critique of provide a liberal critique of equality, even though I showed you that they end up disagreeing with each other, right? And I guess all of this slide is intended to show you that these two different views argue similar things and then yet end up disagreeing with each other. So liberalism says that human beings are morally equal, that men and women and people from different cultures are morally equal. Feminists say that women are morally equal but different to men. So different but morally equal. Multiculturalists say that people from different cultures are different from each other and yet morally equal at the same time. Right? So it's a very similar argument, and yet what we see is that feminists and multiculturalists tend to have areas where they debate and disagree with each other as well. Alright, so that's multiculturalism. I'd probably say that that's not the only criticism that can be made of multiculturalism, right? If we compare what we talked about today to the lecture on nationalism, we can see that people who believe in the importance of a single language, a single culture, and therefore making up a single national unity are probably likely to have big disagreements with multiculturalism as well. So it's not the only way of arguing against it. But sort of, you can understand the context of the debate between multiculturalism, where there's lots of different cultures in one place, and it's either okay or good, and nationalism, which strongly says we need a single, unified national culture for a nation to exist and to flourish. Okay. So